right, I proceed to start thanking people. I want to start by acknowledging that we're all here today on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish nations and the Coast Salish peoples, and acknowledge that with gratitude that they're so generous in sharing it with us. I'm particularly mindful of the moment of what's going on New Brunswick with Mi'kmaq and Maliseet people in the fight against fracking, which was largely ignored by the Canadian media all summer through peaceful protest, and has suddenly gotten a lot of attention when RCMP cars were set on fire, and it looks like the situation is rapidly escalating. In any case, we stand here on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, and I also want to start by saying a huge thank you to Deborah Campbell, who is someone whose writing is quite extraordinary and whose work as a journalist. I mean, I write nonfiction, but I'm not going to dangerous places to write about it. And Deborah's quite brave and goes to all kinds of dangerous places to write about what's going on in the world. And I also want to thank Mark, because that was a wonderful introduction, and I've never had one quite like it in terms of defining me as a writer, in terms of my literary genre. At one point in my life, I hadn't planned to talk about this, but it fits. You'll see why. I was studying theology before I decided to run for leader of the Green Party of Canada, and I loved my theological studies. And one of my favorite professors, who was a Catholic priest and was teaching the course on a review of the Pentateuch through exegesis, word by word, line by line, and he at one point was describing one of the books of Genesis, and he was a French-Canadian Catholic priest, and he said, "This is my favorite word in English and French. This," he was describing the first few verses of Genesis, "is my favorite genre. My favorite genre is myth." I mean, it was a word that he could say in French, but couldn't say in English and French. It was quite marvelous. So anyway, I thought that was in any case, my favorite genre is apparently innocuous, although if it wasn't for various crises, particularly the climate crisis, the ecological crisis, and the mess we're in, I like to imagine that I would be able to be a fiction writer. And I like to imagine that I could, turn my hand to, something challenging as a writer. This is challenging stuff in terms of where we are as a country, so I'll turn my attention to that. And as you heard, this is, as you know, yesterday was the speech from the throne. So against all the great planning Deborah and I had done for picking a night when Parliament could not possibly be in session, because there's always a parliamentary break for the week after Thanksgiving, we find ourselves with first a prorogation, and yesterday we resumed in Parliament for the speech from the throne. I'm glad we started from the point of view of discussing literature, because one of the themes as I've crossed the country in recent weeks during the prorogation, holding town hall meetings about democracy, one of the recurring themes is that the words we use really do matter. The way issues are framed really matters. And when Canadians are described primarily as consumers and instead of as citizens, that matters in how we talk about democracy. The fact that so much of the richness of our traditions as Westminster parliamentary democracy has been so badly, so desperately, dangerously forgotten, that the rituals of the speech from the throne are observed, if anything, as sort of a quaint anachronism. If anybody watched any coverage of it, I know that the media does a blow-by-blow coverage every year. This time was part of the ceremony, but I could imagine it because I used to watch it, where they try to fill in the time and say, well, now the Governor-General's approaching Parliament. And now, the Governor-General's found his seat at the throne and has been greeted by the Prime Minister. And now they have the 21-gun salute. Well, that was actually before outside. And now you will see the usher of the black rod has left the Senate and is marching down to gain entry into the Commons, where the doors will be shut. These are important concepts, and I wrote my own speech from the throne for yesterday, which you can find online if you want to, but I decided to make it a citizens first agenda and start by writing words for an imaginary Governor-General for a point hypothetically when I'd be a Prime Minister, that these rituals matter, that they are expressing over and over again some of the fundamental precepts of Westminster parliamentary democracy that are actually important in terms of how we're governed. And the tour across Canada has highlighted for me over and over again how Canadians are also extremely concerned about what they see as a decline in democracy, and at the same time really fascinated and interested in what these traditions are and why they matter. So for the speech from the throne yesterday, the fundamental message there dates back really to Magna Carta. It's a King John on Runnymede moment, where the fact that the doors are closed to the king's representative, or in our modern era, the queen's representative, the governor general, is a symbolic expression of the fundamental principle that Parliament is supreme, that a legitimate government only exists by consent of the governed, and that the king does not have the right to make rules that affect the commoners. In 1215, of course, it was noblemen, but they were commoners, without the consent of the governed. That they must, and if they don't, that the king is not. In other words, the king is not actually in charge. The commoners, the people's representatives, must be consulted, and that's why we go through that ceremony. The doors are shut, and in the UK, when the Prime Minister, because the UK still observes more of these traditions more accurately, in the UK, the Prime Minister walks with all the members of Parliament to the doors of the House of Lords, and just as in Canada, I don't know how many of you were really watching this closely yesterday or at all, but it certainly wasn't worth listening to the speech, but I mean the part that happened ahead of time is significant. So we all walk as commoners, and in our system of government, in theory, all members of Parliament are equal, including the Prime Minister. Prime Minister's role is to be first among equals. That's the theory. So there's a brass barrier, and it can be opened to let in the appropriate people who are in a red chamber, and they are, as we know, senators and representatives of what is essentially the descendant of the British House of Lords. Anyway, that we stand behind that brass barrier and listen to the speech while standing, spilling back out. Obviously, all MPs can't fit in the little space that's by the door to the Senate. We spill back through the space that's there and stand on the side of the bar that says, "We're commoners, we're here to hear an address," well aware that the address has been prepared by whatever party has a majority of seats in the House. Interestingly, of course, and if you can conjure in your mind's eye speeches from the throne in Canada over quite a long period of time, the Prime Minister sits to the right of the throne in which the Governor General sits, usually the Speaker's chair in the Senate. And that's a break with tradition, and it's, to me, offensive. So in my imaginary speech from the throne, I made the point that the Prime Minister is standing with all the other members of Parliament on the other side of that brass barrier. That's really quite important, that the movement in Canada, which has not been only under Stephen Harper, of allowing the Prime Minister to creep closer and closer and closer to the throne, is actually a dangerous thing. And that's where I'll start, because I didn't want to talk about the speech from the throne too very long, but it was just yesterday. And I will try to make sure that I stop talking about the crisis in Canadian democracy with enough time for everybody, well, for as many people as possible to ask questions. The essence of democracy, and it's a difficult topic because we take it for granted in many ways. It's as if it's part of the Canadian geography that we live in a democracy. But the reality is that democracy anywhere is something of an experiment. It's always a work in progress, and there's nothing static about it. And the other reality is that modern democracies in many industrialized countries are actually in quite a lot of trouble. And there's a certain irony to this. Anthony Giddens, who was a British academic who delivered the prestigious Reith Lectures in 1999, made the point that there's this really interesting tension that in developing countries around the world, people are willing to risk their lives to get democracy, risk their lives to go vote. The Taliban can say, "We're going to kill you if we find your finger is inked with purple to say you voted in Afghanistan." Or the people in Zimbabwe who'd escaped across the crocodile-infested Limpopo River to get away from Robert Mugabe, who then crossed back over that same river to have a chance to vote, to get rid of him. So here are people willing to risk their lives to vote in developing countries around the world. And Professor Giddens' point was obviously not just in relation to Canada, but not even specifically to Canada, but in general, that in modern industrialized countries that have had democracy for quite a while, an alarming portion of the populations is disillusioned and disenchanted and disengaged. Certainly not willing to risk their lives to go out and vote. As a matter of fact, if the largest voting bloc in Canada in the last election, had they been able to form government, would have been called the We Stayed Home Party. Because the largest voting bloc in Canada in 2011, which was 40%, was more votes stayed home, in other words, than showed up to vote for a Conservative candidate or anybody else. So that suggests a high level of disengagement, which in itself is signs of democracy in crisis. That engagement in democracy is at the core of what was our earliest known democracy, which of course was in ancient Athens, ancient Greece. Not a perfect democracy, we certainly know that. Slaves couldn't vote, women couldn't vote. They weren't citizens, nor were they considered really even human by some philosophers. But in ancient Greece, if you were a citizen of that state, you were presumed to take an interest. Not only were you presumed to take an interest, it was the essence and the core of your identity as an Athenian that you were engaged and involved. Pericles said of the city-state of Athens that a man who does not participate in the city, we do not think lives at all. So it wasn't just a statement of some sub-portion bracketed identity that related to what you do as a citizen in voting every few years. It was a social identity, it was a cultural identity, it was bounded in community, it was part of who you were as a citizen, that you were engaged in the life of your city, engaged in the life of your democracy. That's a hard standard to keep up over thousands of years, and it's particularly hard when people feel less and less engaged in the process of their community, their government, their city, their province, their country. And we're less engaged and less involved for a number of reasons. I think one of them is electoral dysfunction. So, in a city, in a country like Canada, or province of BC, where our vote is on a winner-take-all system, district by district. So obviously first past the post leads to people in what might be considered a safe Liberal riding or a safe Tory riding think, why would I bother to vote? I know how it's going to turn out. My vote's not going to count. So when you have a more effective, healthy voting system, you get higher voter turnout. This is certainly the case when you look around the world at the countries, and most modern democracies do have proportional representation. So if you're looking at the voter turnout in the Scandinavian nations, it's over 80%. If you look throughout Europe, most of the, and now we have New Zealand since the early 90s has changed to mixed member proportional, voter turnout is higher. But the crisis in Canadian democracy that I want to talk about tonight is also that we've lost that, as I was describing earlier, that understanding of what our system of government actually is. Now, part of this is because we live so close to the United States. We watch a lot of political news out of the US, and it's very easy for people to think, God help us, we even have people who are leaders of federal political parties in Canada who say things like, I'm running for Prime Minister. Or in the case of Stephen Harper in the fall of 2008, who said that the effort by the parties that together formed more seats in the House of Commons than his party had at the end of the 2008 election, that any effort to work collaboratively to form a different government was, in his words, an effort to overturn the results of the election. Now, that statement stood without, I heard someone laugh over here, why the national media wasn't falling off their chairs, right? Saying, how outrageous, what a blooper. Can we imagine that Stephen Harper thinks that, now in other nations, by the way, at the end of an election such as the one we had in 2008, rather than big headlines the next morning, Stephen Harper has won a minority government, they would have said, election results in hung parliament. We've lost the thread of a lot of what goes on in Westminster parliamentary democracy. Now, where we began to have a problem, and basically I should, at this point, tell you that the title of the talks I gave across Canada, this is basically taking advantage of Green College, that you were already inviting me to talk about my work and my writings, and I am working on a new book, and it will be out next fall. So I'm still a writer. But my tour across Canada was called Save Democracy from Politics. And by that, I certainly don't mean to demean political activism. Small p, political. I've been a political activist all my life. It's only that I didn't join a political party till 2006. by save democracy from politics, what I mean to say is, particularly since becoming an elected member of Parliament, which is the single greatest honor I've ever received, and a huge level of commitment to be of service to my constituents. That's my overriding commitment these days, is that I work for the voters and the citizens of Saanich Gulf Islands. I don't believe that I work for the Green Party at all. My job is to represent the voters and the constituents and the interests of Saanich Gulf Islands. That's how our system of government is supposed to work. So when I say save democracy from politics, what I'm going to tell you is, since I became elected, I'm more alarmed than ever about the most immediate threat to Canadian democracy, which is organized political parties and the power they wield, not just during elections, but after them, in controlling what goes on within Parliament. So I was shocked, for instance. I thought I'm pretty familiar with parliamentary procedure. I had worked in the 1980s for the Minister of Environment, who in those days, I don't know how many of you remember, I mean, it was the 86 to 88. Anyone who remembers anything will know that Brian Mulroney was Prime Minister. I have to admit, I wasn't a fan. I wasn't a member of that party, and I've been accused of that because I did go to work for Tom McMillan, who was Minister of Environment in 1986 as his senior policy advisor. And I'm so grateful that I did have that opportunity. And my gratitude grows by the day, because I realize in Parliament, from conversations I have with other MPs, that I'm virtually the only one there who knows how things are supposed to work. I'm the only one there with any kind of institutional memory. So that when I say to friends in the Conservative caucus, but you know, when I worked for Tom McMillan, none of his speeches had to be approved in advance by the Prime Minister's office. I said, really? Like, not at all? I said, no, never, actually. They didn't even want to see them? No, never. I said, the minister would be making changes to his speeches. Tom and I worked on his speeches together, and quite often, even as he went to the podium, he was scribbling changes. No, they're shocked. Really? Because now the PMO controls everything, every syllable, every word, not just out of the mouths of the ministers and not just out of the mouths of the MPs, but increasingly out of the mouths of every single civil servant in the Government of Canada, which is another huge outrage, because right up until Stephen Harper, the independence and professionalism of our professional civil service was beyond question. And it would have been so, well, it is appalling, but people would have known it was appalling. This is what happens. Like we're in early stages, Alzheimer's in our political culture, that we don't recognize what's happening. The wall between the Prime Minister's office and the civil service at the highest level of Canada is the Privy Council office. Okay, let's go back to some of these funny old terms. Privy Council is those who are privy to the monarchy's secrets. In other words, the state's secrets. So a Privy Council is another term for the federal cabinet. To be a Privy Councillor is a big deal. So the Privy Council office is the clerk of Privy Council, who's the most powerful bureaucrat in Canada, and is the one who, in theory at least, gives directions to the deputy ministers and hears from deputy ministers. And the independence and professionalism of the civil service is this. A great clerk to Privy Council, whom some of you may read because he's writing a great blog these days, Alex Himmelfarb. Alex Himmelfarb described it when I used to go in and talk to him when I was with Sierra Club, and imagine that we were allowed in the Prime Minister's offices in those days. You could actually walk in and have meetings with people. These days they only let in industry. So I used to go. No, it's true. I used to go in and have meetings with the civil servants, and I remember Alex Himmelfarb described the dividing line between the Prime Minister's office and the Privy Councillor's office as being a Chinese firewall. Information had to flow both ways, but you were never allowed to have the partisan political side of the operation demand that the independent civil service provide the evidence you need for a decision you've already made. The independence and professionalism of the civil service was that there was evidence-based decision-making. So the civil servants would, and they didn't make mistakes sometimes, but they would provide a basis for good public policy making and a range of options. Now, obviously, the politicians were in charge to make that decision because they're the elected ones. But it would have been unheard of. And I remember when I worked for Tom McMillan, there was one particular scientist in Ontario who was doing groundbreaking work showing up dioxin in gulls' eggs through the Great Lakes. And he was getting us in trouble with Health Canada because he couldn't resist mentioning that if we were finding dioxin in gulls' eggs through the Great Lakes, that did tend to suggest there might be problems for human health as well. And so, Minister of Environment, turf wars between departments are another whole matter. But my boss was getting a little bit of flack from Health Canada that Doug Hallett, this scientist from Ontario, was making these comments about how if there's dioxin in gull eggs, what does it mean for human health? Can we ask that question? And I remember when he was saying, gosh, I wish Doug would think, because like, I'm trying to be on his side, and we think this is important research. And I can remember sort of venting. We all said, but you know, Tom, it's not like you can tell Dr. Hallett what to say, right? He said, no, I know we can't, but, you know. And now, forget it. Do you know the only one job classification in the civil service that has gone up dramatically since Stephen Harper became Majority Prime Minister is the group of people called information officers. Their number has grown by 15%. It's extraordinary, because there's fewer and fewer scientists, and there's more and more people following them around to make sure they don't say the wrong thing. So it's an Orwellian term, because the information officers are in charge of making sure there's no information that gets out that offends the Prime Minister's agenda. The trends are really disturbing. Since I became elected, and as I said, I knew what Parliament used to be like. We used to see, as a routine, predictable, and in fact, the essence of the job of parliamentarians was making sure that Parliament controlled the public purse, and that legislation put before the House was thoroughly vetted, expert witnesses were heard, and amendments were entertained to improve legislation. When I worked in Ottawa in the 1980s, a parliamentary hearing room looking at legislation was essentially, even if question period looked like, you know, fisticuffs were about to break out, well, actually, they were pretty tame in those days. Even the partisan sparring was much better natured and a lot more elevated in tone. Well, that's probably because people got to stand up and say what they were thinking and didn't have to read from cue cards. That's what they do now. They have to read from cue cards. But even as partisan as question period was, if you went to a parliamentary committee, it was as if you had to check your partisanship at the door, roll up your sleeves and see, what can we do to improve this legislation? That's what I mean about me having institutional memory, because when I tell other MPs about that, they don't believe me. Because right now, they're just as scripted and just as controlled and just as partisan as what they do in the House. So that it's an atrocity that legislation can go from first reading to royal assent. I mean, it's a contempt of Parliament for legislation to go from first reading to royal assent without a single change being made. And this is routine, right? Over 95% of the bills in the last 2 years have had not a single amendment accepted through parliamentary review. And that includes Bill C-38, the monstrous omnibus budget bill of spring of 2012 that was 440 pages long, changed, gutted, repealed 70 different acts. Not one comma, not one semicolon changed from first reading to royal assent. And why? Because Stephen Harper would view a single amendment as a political defeat. Even when drafting errors are discovered, they do not accept changes. There were drafting errors uncovered in C-38 that weren't changed till C-45, the second omnibus budget bill that was put forward on the claim that it implemented the 2012 budget, but which in fact included most actually of C-38 wasn't referenced in the 2012 budget. No changes in C-45 either, but some of the drafting errors in C-38 were corrected in C-45. No amendments, no changes. The hyper-partisanship, of course, is most visible when you look at the voting records of members of Parliament. And what I found shocking once I was elected was that at every vote, now by the way, for votes, we get 30-minute bells, and you go, most people at that point are up and out of the House. Well, this is another secret. It's not really a secret. I can tell you this. People are surprised that I love being a member of Parliament. I may not have mentioned this yet. I love being a member of Parliament. I love being in the House of Commons. I love my desk, even though it's the farthest away from anything that can possibly be found. I'm up against the translator's booth. There's only 2 chairs in the House where you can't push them all the way back. The one in the corner of the Conservatives and mine back there. There are 308 members of Parliament. I often ask grade school kids this because it's a fun question, but I'll ask you. Just guess what desk I have, what number desk? 309. It's, you never would guess that. And then I usually tell grade school kids that I think it's like platform 9 3/4, and is a place with mystical potential. In any case, I love everything about being in the House of Commons. And the other thing that is a secret that I should share more widely is that I also love the people with whom I work. Most MPs are really great people of all parties, excellent people, which is why it's so completely outrageous that their talents are squandered being told what to do by lesser people who never bothered to put themselves forward or run for Parliament at all, which is a particular nasty little group of people in all the other parties who are in charge of making sure that the leader's message discipline is protected. Message discipline is now celebrated by the media, which is another big problem of the crisis in Canadian democracy, the absence of any effective journalism at the national level. And so what you have is members of Parliament being told how to vote every single time. And these are great people. And a whole bunch of us were brand new in 2011. So 110 new MPs came in. And whether they were Conservative or NDP or Liberal, they went through a vast process of disillusionment very quickly, where they were told what their job really was, which was to take orders and not get out of line. So every single vote, every single time, these lovely young pages, university students, go from desk to desk with the instructions for how to vote. The Liberal Party's instructions, the NDP's instructions. They're nervous sometimes because the desks are kind of side by each, and you don't want to put the NDP instructions on a Liberal desk or in the Conservative. Every vote, every time. So what we have here, if we take it in total, we've seen an unhealthy growth in something that doesn't exist in our Constitution at all, and that's the Prime Minister's office. We've seen an unhealthy growth in the powers of leaders of political parties, which started actually by accident. I'm sure it was an accident in the late 1960s, when they decided to put the party affiliation of candidates on the ballots next to the candidates' names. Up till 1970, if you were voting in Canada, you just saw the names of the candidates, not their party affiliation. And so in amending the Elections Act, they decided, well, how are we going to know that so-and-so who claims that they represent the Liberal Party really does? I know we'll get the leader to sign their nomination papers. So they put in the hands of the leader for the first time a really effective tool to threaten and control their caucus. I won't sign your nomination papers. Whereas in other Westminster parliamentary democracies, like in the UK or in Australia or in New Zealand, you still have the caucus having the power over the leader. It's the reverse here. Remember, Margaret Thatcher didn't lose an election. She was ousted by her own Conservative caucus in the UK, and John Major took over. And in Australia, we had revolving doors where we had Kevin Rudd of the Labour Party displaced by Julia Gillard of the Labour Party, and then she was displaced before the next election by Kevin Rudd again. In Canada, it's the reverse. The leader of the party has the ability to threaten members of that caucus, but the caucus has no ability to pull the plug on the leader. So now we've got the worst of all worlds. We've got leaders with power to control their caucus, and although Pierre Trudeau started it out, I'm sure it was really quite minor levels of interest that he had in controlling what went on, there wasn't a Prime Minister's office as an entity until Pierre Trudeau. Before Trudeau, under Lester B. Pearson, and I talked to Tom Kent, who was a wonderful Canadian who passed away a couple of years ago. He was principal secretary to Lester B. Pearson, and he described the Prime Minister's office under Pearson as a couple stenographers and file clerks. Trudeau created it so he could gently organize to make sure that his Minister of Justice and Minister of Health didn't make major policy announcements on the same day, thus frustrating good media coverage for either of them. So let's just coordinate this a bit. This is no longer coordinating a bit. This is a powerful central controlling agency, which is in essence an elected dictatorship. And that's what PMO has become. It was creeping in the power of centralizing control through every prime minister since Pierre Trudeau, and it's been under Harper that that level of centralized control is no longer creeping, but galloping. I could cite many examples. I just thought I'd read a little bit from a recent article by Senator Lowell Murray, who retired recently. He was actually in PMO with Mulroney. He's a very, very fine man who was a progressive conservative who never took up membership in the new, basically it's not a conservative party, it's some sort of Tea Party North. But Lowell Murray said this about what's happened, and he described the centralization of power under PMO that had gradually happened. But he said what has happened under Stephen Harper is, quote, he superimposed on the existing centralized system a tightly run communications regime in which message control is the very essence of governance. Under this system, even strong ministers often become passengers on their own departmental ships, their destination and course set by remote control from Message Central, which he wrote capital M, capital C, at PCO/PMO. Parliament is not even in the picture. At its worst, the system makes ciphers of ministers, reducing from substantive to symbolic the autonomy, authority, and accountability they should exercise. Cabinet ministers under Stephen Harper, they were once described by Don Martin when he used to write for the National Post as performing the role. They were arrayed in a semicircle behind Harper for an announcement, and Don Martin described him as performing the role traditionally performed by potted plants. Now, potted plants, in fairness, can't read cue cards. So these cabinet ministers under Stephen Harper are also in charge of being the public relations spokespersons for their area of responsibility, but they actually have no working understanding of what's going on in their departments. And everything is run out of PMO. And the partisan operatives out of PMO with a budget that was cresting at about $10 million, I think it's gone down a titch, but it's about a $10 million a year operation for which you can get no accountability beyond the fact that 80% of it is for salaries, is completely focused on making sure that whoever is in PMO retains power. And now that that firewall between PMO and PCO is down, these malevolent pipsqueak spin doctor creeps feel entitled and empowered to go and browbeat every scientist, every bureaucrat, every MP, and I think a few of the media as well. So we've gone from evidence-based decision-making to decision-based evidence-making. It's a theft of democracy in plain sight, and Stephen Harper's accumulation of more power unto himself represents a threat that will extend well beyond when he leaves office. And this is what I wanted to close on, because this is not even, I hope, primarily a partisan rant. This is about a threat to democracy, that if it was being posed by a foreign threat, God knows if anyone did have the misfortune of listening to yesterday's speech from the throne, you will have heard such terms as Canada having military might, which, for the good of the world, we apparently use sparingly. And we are a warrior nation, by God. Well, I think that probably is why Stephen Harper told Barack Obama he wasn't going to take no for an answer on the Keystone Pipeline, as he began to believe all those War of 1812 commercials over and over again, that we're a nation capable of going down to the White House and kicking some ass if Barack Obama doesn't give us our pipeline. But anyway, I digress. This is primarily not a partisan rant. This is about what happens when Justin Trudeau or Thomas Mulcair, or take your pick of those folks who will come after, walk into Langevin Block and go into the beautiful, well-appointed Prime Minister's office and find on the desk a complete console with all levers of power. Power to control your caucus, power to control all the scientists, the civil servants, the messages, the decisions, power to control the agencies. They've hollowed out the integrity of the entire civil service and made it a political operation in the interest of whatever party's in power. So the question is, which one of those fellows will decide, oh my God, I have far too much power. This is dangerous. It must be disassembled. The only way that we're going to be able to get to electoral reform, such as getting rid of first past the post, or parliamentary reform to control and limit the power of political parties, to control and limit the unholy power of the Prime Minister's office over the entire apparatus of government. And by the way, this is duplicated in provinces across Canada, with premiers' offices having too much control. The only way we're ever going to get back to an actual democracy where members of Parliament represent their constituents, where they may run under a political banner that lets you know more or less where they stand on issues. But when you go to Parliament, by God, your job is to represent your constituents, not take your marching orders, your talking points, and your, every breath you take once you become an elected person is on command from a bunch of backroom spin doctors. If we're ever going to break out of that, these issues have to become election issues, and we have to get commitments from opposition parties that once in office, they will dismember Prime Minister's office, reassert the independence and the roles, responsibilities, duties of individual members of Parliament, restore the nonpartisan work of seeking the greatest good for the greatest number, trying to ensure that Parliament is supreme, that parliamentarians know what they're doing, and that not everything is about who gets the slightest electoral advantage from a wedge issue. By definition, wedge issues are about denying political consensus, finding divisions, and exploiting them. If we can't get back to a healthy democracy, and one can argue whether we ever had one that was as good as what we'd want, we'll have no one to blame but ourselves because we decided to sit it out till a better dictator came along. And it's time for an end to elected dictatorships in Canada. Thank you.